Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a trilogy review for Ash Princess, Lady Smoke, and Ember Queen. The first part of this is going to be completely non-spoiler, so even if you haven't read the first one, I'm not going to be spoiling anything throughout the series, but then at the end I'll jump into some specific spoilers for the last one. If you want to see specific spoilers for the first two, I'll go ahead and link my book reviews and chats for those. This trilogy is a new favorite for me, which is so exciting. I love when that happens, especially when it's not a series that you were expecting to become a new favorite and it's kind of a surprise favorite. And the reason that this was a surprise favorite for me is because while I enjoyed the first two, I ultimately wasn't that moved by them. I didn't have a super strong emotional connection to what was going on. It was more that I was really gripped by the story and I was engrossed in it. But when I finished the story, I was like, oh, I enjoyed that. And it wasn't really a, oh my gosh, I can't stop thinking about it. Oh man, I need to tell everybody about this series. It wasn't really that feeling. But that has changed now. The third book was so good and it was a great ending to this trilogy. It completely has shifted my perspective on this story. The setup for the story is one that is quite dark, and I always feel terrible because the setup sounds so morbid, and yet I always talk about how the story is filled with tropes in the first one and how it's pure entertainment for me. The setup is that our main character, whose name is Theodosia, her home of Astraea was conquered by a group known as the Calavaxians, and the Calavaxians kept her alive. She was the heir to the throne. They killed her mother. They killed pretty much everybody of significance in the political sphere, and they have kept her so that throughout her life, they could publicly beat her and whip her, torture her. They could do terrible things to her publicly to try to keep any rebellions from forming. If a rebellion does form, it's like they're punishing her people through her. So her life has been terrible. She has a spark of hope. She has a chance to do something, and she finally realizes, I need to stop being used against my people. I'm going to try and do something for my people, and that's when the story picks up. The first one gets going right away. It starts in a place that it somewhat throws you in and you're like, whoa, because you're almost disoriented, but you catch on very quickly. All this is laid out for you quite easily, and there's some pretty intense moments right away, and it definitely propels you forward in that first one. And I found when I read Ash Princess that I pretty much read it in a day just because of that propelling you forward factor. However, and I don't say this as a means of being negative, I just think for myself, the first one, part of what kept it moving, what kept it going, is the fact that it was a little tropey and it was kind of familiar territory. I wouldn't say a person being used against their own people and publicly tortured and whatnot. I wouldn't say that that's the familiar element, but rather this claim to the throne. That's definitely very familiar, and I eat that up. I love that. So that factor, the fact that it does move very quickly and it was fast-paced, there's a lot of scheming and politicking in it, that was something up my wheelhouse. I love that kind of stuff. And then there are some tropes in that first one. There's a love triangle. I know a lot of people hate love triangles. They immediately think less of a story. They often don't even want to pick it up if there's a hint of one. But what I will say is that while I'm not going to elaborate too much on it and the significance of it throughout the story or anything like that, because I don't want to ruin your experience, but I personally felt that the main character, at the end of the day, her goal was always to do what she had to do for her people. And therefore, the love triangle wasn't one of those things where it's like, oh, the world's ending, but which boy do I love more? That said, though, the first one, the tropes, there were tropes in it. It was familiar. It was comfortable. The second one was more about the politics. There's not a ton of action in this series, and I would say that's consistent throughout. You're not going to get tons of action where they're fighting in battles. You're not going to get tons of one-on-one sword fights or anything like that. But I actually was happy with it. The amount that we get was really good in my opinion, because I don't know if my tastes are shifting or if I've always been this way and I'm only just recognizing it. But I'm getting to a point where when I read action scenes, they start to feel really irrelevant at the end of the day. They start to feel like they're just there for a change of pace, because in fantasy stories, it's like, oh, this fight scene, that's where it moves forward. And I tend to be so much more invested in what's going on with the characters. And threats to the characters don't always have to come in the form of a fight. And I find that's definitely the case in this series. The threats to not only our main character, but the side characters, they're not always just from, let's battle now. At the end of the day, though, those first two, they really were for me about the fact that I just really had a good time reading them. I enjoyed them. I was wanting to know what was going to happen to the characters. I didn't want bad things to happen to the characters. There were several times where I'm like, is this person going to die right now? I don't want them to die. There were those kind of moments, which I liked. But the third one, there was just this shift. There was this turn in the tone of the story. And I thought it was a good culmination of everything that's been happening. It was a great way to show us how much the characters have gone through, how much it's affected them, and what they want for not only themselves, but for their people, for their kingdom. Their constant efforts to try and do what they have to do for the good of Estrella is admirable. It was one of those things where it's also filled with a lot of really difficult, heavy decisions, because sometimes there's no decision that's going to end in everybody living happily ever after. There are decisions they have to make that are just tremendously difficult, because they know, okay, well, this is the best route, but this route means that these people, they're probably going to die, or this route means we're going to put ourselves in danger, we might die. There's just so many times where they have to make these difficult calls, and those kinds of stories to me, they just feel more realistic's hard, because it's fantasy, there's magic, and the circumstances are not any kind that I've ever experienced, but it just makes it feel more real. It doesn't feel as if there's an easy answer, there's a way out. And at times, our characters can be quite sneaky, and they can do things that I wasn't expecting, and they can do things that turn out way better than you would think they would be able to do. And that was great, but there's also these moments where things fail, and that's great too, because in stories where every single time our main characters succeed, it almost starts to get boring, and it doesn't feel like there's any stakes. But there are stakes in this story, and you start to really feel for not only the main character, but the side characters. And I mentioned that, there would be times in the first ones where I'm like, oh no, I hope this person doesn't die. But in that third one, I was really like, no, I want them to make it. I want them to see their kingdom freed. I want them to have a good life. And if they don't, it's going to make me sad. I didn't realize how much I cared about the side characters until that third one, which is another thing I want to praise in the story, is that the side characters have always played a role in the story. It is a single perspective, first-person series, so you always get our main character, Theodosia. But the side characters, they have rather distinct personalities, and they sometimes clash with our main character. You find yourself sometimes frustrated with them. Sometimes you're really grateful for them, because if our main character is being annoying, they put her in her place. Sometimes they're just all not knowing what to do, and I just found that I genuinely cared about them as well. So not only was I worried about Theodosia and wanting her to survive and wanting her to make it and wanting her to free her people, but I was like, please, 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 make sure the side characters are there too. And I was just shocked at how wrapped up I was in their stories as well. Another thing that I think contributed to this third book being one that really surprised me was that the antagonist, who is the person who conquered her kingdom, the king of the Calavaxians, they call him the Kaiserin. This particular person was never, in my opinion, the most compelling of... They just weren't the best villain I'd come across. You definitely hate them. They're disgusting and they're awful. And for that reason, you love to hate them, because you're like, I really want this guy to die. And I found that to be the case, but I didn't necessarily find myself thinking, oh, I can see why he is the way he is, and I can see why he would do this even though it's bad. I just didn't feel like he had that much complexity to him. We have hints of the kind of person he's been and why he is the way he is, but he still just didn't feel that compelling to me. I actually ended up loving how things played out with the antagonist in the third one. I just found that what the author did was really creative, and it was just very interesting, because I find that while I love the love to hate type villains in the third one, we get this bizarre, oh, I hate this person, but also I sort of feel bad for them, even though I know I shouldn't feel bad for them in the slightest. You don't feel that bad. I will say a small complaint, I guess, on my end was that some of the lesser villains, to me, they didn't feel... I mean, the series got to a point where a lot of the side characters, the main antagonist, the main character, they had a lot of complexity, but some of these henchman type characters were just... They were just that. It was almost like an obstacle for the characters. And these characters weren't really explored much. We only have so much time. So I'm not necessarily upset that she didn't give us the whole backstory about every single henchman. You had enough to know why they were doing the things they were doing. But they just didn't always feel particularly nuanced. As far as the writing itself, it's very digestible. It's very easy to get through. But there are a lot of what I call highlight-worthy moments, these kinds where if you take tabs and you like to tab up good quotes, or if you like to write your favorite quotes. It's been a while since I've read the first two, so I don't know if I can say this with certainty for those, but in the third one, there were a lot of moments where it was like, ooh, I liked that. There is, of course, a slight fear in praising a book so much in a review that I'm going to set you all up with unrealistic expectations of what this has. So I want to try to be as obvious and forward as possible with what is hopefully pretty objective about the story. The first one is very tropey. Second one, pretty tropey. Sometimes characters, they don't always think about things that I feel like there were a couple times I'm like, no, dummy, like, of course this is what's happening. Villains aren't always the most nuanced. Sometimes they feel a little cartoonish. But all the other things I've been gushing about, for me, heavily trumped those things. And I feel like if you can just binge this trilogy, that is what I would recommend doing. So you can see how, in my opinion, the first couple, the fact that they were maybe less mature in tone, I think it was a reflection of where the characters were. I also think it was a reflection of the fact the characters don't really know what they're doing, but they're trying. And then that last one, it's like, oh, we're down to business, and the maturity level is so much stronger, and the characters are... You just see them going from being these young people trying to navigate this terrible world to them being like, we're a part of this world and here's what we can do to make it better. And I hope I can be a part of it. I hope I survive through this. And that weight on their shoulders just, it was really good. A couple of little things that I want to mention before getting into the spoilers. One, I personally think that the audiobook narrator was great. I loved her voice. I can see it not being for everyone, but if you like audiobooks, I would definitely check out those for these. And then also, I would recommend, if you can, to binge this trilogy and try not to wait too long, because there were things that the author included in the third one. There were things that she tied together from early details that I didn't find as hard-hitting as I would have had I read them all back to back. I read them pretty much as they were coming out, and obviously when you have to wait a year or more, you forget some stuff. So I vaguely remembered those things, but I think if you have the opportunity to just read it straight through, you will see how she ties some of these details together. If you have read this series and you've read all of the books and you feel very differently than me, please feel free to say that so that people can go in with, of course, differing opinions, and then hopefully their expectations will be balanced out. Or if you loved it, sing its praises too, because I feel like it is very underrated and I don't see very many people talking about it. But all that said, all that gushing aside, I'm going to get into spoilers now for the third one. If you haven't read, I highly recommend that you stop watching, because I really don't want you guys to be spoiled. Okay, oh my gosh, I didn't cry when I read this, but I'm like so close, because there's a couple of moments that I wanted to talk about, and I like went back to look at the line, and I'm like, oh, why? One of these moments, pretty much, most of my spoilers are going to be about Blaise. Throughout the series, I was like, this guy is not going to make it. I knew he wouldn't make it. But then I was like, is he going to make it? Because she really was making me think that he would, and then he didn't. And how he went out was just, so sad. Oh my gosh, just his story. Okay, you know how in love triangles, people are like, I'm team so-and-so. I would say I've always been team Soren. I'm usually a sucker for the childhood friend romance, but I just never thought that her and Blaise really were good for each other. And not good. It's not like he was toxic or something like that. I just really liked Soren and her together. And I thought Soren was a good guy. But Blaise, I didn't hate the guy, but I just didn't love him. And he was so reckless sometimes. But in this story, Oh my gosh, that one moment when she holds him and he's just crying. And when you think about the life he's had and how hard he has worked to make a better Estrella, and you're like, oh, no, I hope you can make it through this. And he ends up kind of sacrificing, he does sacrifice his magic because he's like, I want to make it. I want to be there at the end. I want to see my kingdom freed. And then he doesn't get to, but he is kind of like the reason so many people live. And the line that got me, oh my gosh, it's right after he dies. And it says, all of that time I spent worrying about how hot his skin was, I never paused to think about how it would feel once it went cold. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, that line. So I already was like kind of close to crying when he died. Sorry. I was almost on the verge of tears. And then that line, I was like, oh my gosh, keep reading, flip the page, because it's like the last line of the page. So it's like, flip the page, just keep going. Did anybody else either cry or get choked up or just really feel that line? Because I really felt that line. Also, I just think that Theodosia, and Blaise's relationship, I really, really like what the author did with it. In the second book, I really appreciated how she was like, guys, you know what? All this love triangle stuff needs to take a backseat because I got to figure stuff out for my kingdom and I need to play this political pool, if you will. And so I really liked that the love triangle, while it was in the first one and I understand why it was there, the second one, she's like, guys, I need to take care of stuff, okay? And then in the third one, I was like, let's get Soren back because I love Soren. I want her to be with Soren. And I was like, let's settle things with Blaise because I want us to move past it. And they did right away, but the way that their relationship played out was just heartbreaking to me because there's that moment where she tells him like, I love you, you know? And he's like, yeah, I know. And just the fact that he knew that his actions were part of why it would never really work between them because he wasn't ready. And I really appreciated that in this story because I think that's pretty realistic. There are a lot of times where people, they love each other and they care about each other, but when they are with one another, they're just not in a place yet where they can really commit to that person because they're not there for themselves and they're living for this other person and they're not where they need to be a healthy partner in a relationship. And he was reckless and he was trying so hard and you feel for him because you know that he's doing all this for a good reason, but it was making him a liability. And Theodosia being like, you're a liability. I can't bring you along on some of these things. That's just how it is. First off, I was like, because I feel like so often in books, it's like, you're my friend. You're always going to be by my side and I believe in you. And she was like, dude, you could jeopardize everything. So sorry, man, sit this one out. With them, when she has that conversation with him about how he's been and what he's done and how she's afraid of him. And he's like, you're afraid of me. I hate this. I hate that I'm like this. I hate that I did this. I let myself get to this place. I should have listened. And she tells him like, yeah, I am afraid of you right now, but I also remember you when we were kids, and I remember when you were there for me, and I needed you when I was nothing, and I hope that someday the way I think of you will be rooted in all those good things. And so when he dies and she thinks about like how she's gonna remember him, if any of you are a sappy mess right now like I am, the exact words, as we walk out of the garden, I don't look back over my shoulder, worried that if I do, that is how I will remember him, cold and dead and lifeless. Instead, I think of him laughing, his eyes bright, mouth soft. I think of him in the heat of battle with an expression drawn tight and fierce. I remember him singing to me, his voice wobbly and off-key. I remember how it felt when he kissed me. I etch him into my memory just like that. That is the Blaise I want to remember for the rest of my days. That's the Blaise I want to remember too. I also want to touch on Cress as the villain, taking a hard left turn here. I was not sure how I was going to feel about her being the villain because I really I wanted this glorious death I wanted like Theodosia to get the Kaiserin and then Cress just like, you're out of here, now it's me. And I was like, I don't know. I feel like it's going to be me. It could be gimmicky or it could be too like, but she's my friend. And there was hints of that, but I feel like realistic hints of it. She was like, I'm probably going to have to kill her. This is what it's going to come down to. So Cress as a villain was, I thought, pretty fascinating, especially when you see she's crazy. And you think about her life where her mother obviously left for a good reason, but her mom left. Her father was this bad person, and then she was married to the Kaiserin, who was also a bad person, surrounded by terrible people. And you're like, this girl is so messed up because of what she's gone through, but like, you kind of feel bad for her because what else was she supposed to become? And when you see these hints of her trying to be a person, but it's so warped and morbid and disturbed, and you're like, man, you're so off right now, and you wish that there was a way that her and Theo, you could go back in time, especially because Theo, that's the other thing, her one friend that had the potential to show her a better world tried to kill her, right? So this girl, like, what else was she gonna become? But you see her do these terrible things, and I don't curse, but the amount of times that I would read and she would be doing something terrible, and I just called her a B word so many times in my head, and like, she would ask a question like, oh, you gonna try to kill me? I'd be like, yeah, B, that's right, I am gonna try to, like, I would get really worked up in my head, like, come on, Theo, tell her off. There was that moment where she, in the dream, was holding the knife to her, and she's like, what, are you gonna kill me? Are you gonna kill me? And Theo knows that she can't kill her because that could just make things even worse. And she has that little speech about, like, I'm coming for you. And that speech was so satisfying, but more satisfying than that was at the end, and this was brutal, and I was alone reading this, and I was reading the physical book, I wasn't listening to the audiobook, but I got to this part, and when this happened, I was like, ah. It was the part where when she gives her the knife, and she's like, basically like, go ahead and kill yourself. It's a better death than having everybody see you executed, everybody that hates you. And Cress said, if there is an after like you believe, I hope that one day I'll see you there. And when she says, if there is an after, you won't be allowed in, I was like, dang, that's the last thing she's told before she dies. Oh man. I won't say too much more because I've already talked for a really long time. Those were the two biggest things. Just Cress as a villain and those moments, they were good. And then Blaise. I just really loved in this last book how it was so much about sacrifice, what they're willing to do, the hard decisions they're willing to make for the good of the kingdom, for the good of the future, and making sure that this doesn't continuously happen. I loved how we took the time to have the characters get to express wanting to live through this. And oh my gosh, that's the other thing too. When Blaise said that he was afraid, I was like, no, don't be afraid to die. Say that like you're ready to die. So when he said he was afraid, I was like, oh no. Sorry, I just remembered that part. I feel like my brain blocked it out because I can only handle so much sadness when it comes to Blaise. I just so love this book, and I need to stop because I feel like I'm getting so annoying. I'm just gonna end it. This is the end. Thanks for watching. If you love the third book too and you want to talk spoilers, please don't spoil people. Just write spoilers and then enter a bunch of times. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you hated it, I'd be very interested to see what you didn't like about it. That'll be really fascinating for me since I obviously loved it. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.